High above the world, in the valley of the Nepal, in the ancient capital of Kathmandu, in Lagin Silicana, an ancient palace, up its narrow staircases and in its dark basements, there existed a treasure. It was a treasure built up over time, in a slow accumulation of pieces. It was a forgotten treasure, covered in grime and dust, as its owners and keepers no longer had a use for it. These were the practical men of the Royal Nepalese Army, charged with protecting their king and country. Would this treasure be found, or would it slowly continue to decay?
We're taking off for Mount Everest this morning on Buddha Air.
In 2003, a man found himself flying above the roof of the world. Thrilled at the fantastic sights before and below him, he was even more excited about his destination. This particular flight was one of the culminating steps in a journey that had taken more than 25 years. Christian Cranmer is an antique weapons collector and dealer of long standing. Through all the years of his dealing, first on weekends and then as a full-time enterprise, Cranmer maintained a passionate interest in a trove of weapons he'd first heard about when he was just out of school. The story was that a traveler in a faraway land, in a mysterious city, was let into an ancient palace and found it filled with weapons, the collection of centuries. Useless to the army that had used them, they were a unique collection, perhaps the last such collection in the world. Antiques, they were red meat to someone like Cranmer. For him, they became a quest. With Mark Doughton, his colleague, Cranmer ran IMA, but Kathmandu was never far from his thoughts. How did this lifelong fascination begin? There is evidence that suggests his curiosity about weapons and their history came with his birth.
Like most English families, I was sent to boarding school at the age of 8, which was a terrible experience.
Every 6 to 8 weeks there would be a film night, and Hollywood's films of the 30s stirred a basic interest in history and weapons. As a genuine interest in history developed, especially the English Civil War, there was support from his father.
My father bought this sword with me in an antique shop in the West Country, right where all this took place, and it was dug up at a place called Luton Tracy. I've still got it. It cost the princely sum of 10 shillings. It wasn't until many years later I found out that it was a sword that wasn't even made until 1795, but I've still kept it because to me that was part of the original cross.
Later films also helped to maintain his passion. Even though this officer's pistol is from a date later than the Battle of Rorke's Drift, the film got the stirring power of empire just right.
And they haven't come again.
Mr. Charter, patrols come back. Zulus have gone. All of them. It's a miracle.
If it's a miracle, Colour Sergeant, it's a short chamber boxer Henry .45 caliber miracle.
And a bayonet, sir, with some guts behind it.
Thus armed with a love for history fired by Hollywood, and a practical turn that could only be satisfied by having authentic history in his hands, a chance meeting with Cedric Flashman from his old school, known as Harry Flashman to his schoolmates, added goals to Cranmer's life he might never otherwise have had.
And at the age of 24, I was actually just meandering down Oxford Street in London, near to which I worked in Hanover Square, and I ran into a guy I hadn't seen for several years. And he and I had never been close, but he couldn't wait to tell me that he had been around the world at his parents' expense after university, and he had stumbled on this cache of antique weapons, or old weapons, in Kathmandu in the Himalayas. I, of course, thought he was full of potatoes. However, over a drink, he gave me a lot of information that I knew then he was absolutely deadly serious and had absolutely no interest in it at all.
Cranmer was entranced. A huge chunk of the empire's history hidden away in a little kingdom. How had this come to pass?
The relationship between Britain and Nepal is a long-standing one, going back 200 years or more. It goes back really to the first attempts made by the British East India Company to engage the Nepalese. Initially, this was a peaceable affair, it dates from the 1790s.
In 1813, Nepal invaded northern India and Bhutan and Sikkim in the south. In the north, they penetrated as far as Dehradun and the hill stations of Missouri and Simla. This cut off the East India Company's administration in Delhi from the cool hill stations that they used in the summers. And immediately the East India Company sent armies up to expel these invaders.
Unfortunately for the British, the Nepalese were far better in the mountains and mountain fighting than the British troops were. And they managed to fight the British back with heavy losses. The British East India Company, of course, could not live with this problem.
At which point the East India Company sent 4 different armies into Nepal itself, 3 of which were totally decimated. And you never read any of this in British history books. One of the commanders deserted. Just one of the East India Company armies, under Major General Sir David Ochterlony, an American born in Boston, a loyalist, defeated the Nepalese army at Malbanpur in 1816. He proceeded to within 60 miles of Kathmandu, and then the Nepalese came to terms.
This, of course, brought an end to the proceedings, and the Treaty of Sagoli, signed in 1816, forced the Nepalese back into their own territory and enabled the British East India Company to apply quite stringent terms and conditions to the deal.
It allowed the British to trade with Nepal, which they hadn't done before, to cross Nepal and trade with Tibet, which was highly desirable, apparently. But also, because of the lessons learned by the British, to recruit Gurkha tribesmen to serve in the British Army. Something which, of course, has continued today, and we still have Gurkha regiments in the British Army who are, for want of a better term, they're mercenaries.
The British were allowed to install what they called a resident in Kathmandu. The resident was the British figurehead. His job was to interpret the wishes of the Nepalese government and try to ensure that the guns they were asking for, and many other stores, were not actually supplied, or at least only those that the British wished to supply were supplied.
The effect was that Nepal could only deal with the outside world via the East India Company and England. The Crown particularly wanted to limit and control the flow of weapons to Nepal, and did so effectively for most of the next 100 years.
The Nepalese did actually have a weapons-making capability before the Treaty of Sagoli was signed. There's some evidence to show that they were making cannon at the end of the 18th century. But there is no doubt that by the 1820s and the 1830s, the Nepalese were making muskets in surprisingly large quantity, but we believe with locks that they were importing. And that, as far as we know, is the state of their technology at the time. It was primitive, it was very labour intensive, but they were capable of making flintlock muskets in the tens of thousands. As we know, and the documents tend to prove, the British were very, very reluctant to supply the Nepalese with any cutting-edge technology. State-of-the-art weaponry was definitely not one of the options. It was pretty well known, some of the British reports say this all the time, that the Nepalese were very skilled artisans and they could copy virtually anything. So the British were pretty keen to keep modern manufacturing machinery out of Nepal, and also to ensure that the Nepalese army depended on weapons supplied from Britain or from India, rather than encouraging the Nepalese to make it themselves. Having said that, the Nepalese did make them themselves. They were quite capable of reverse engineering, if you like, anything they got. They would never have been given blueprints. They simply took the guns, took them apart, reconstructed how to make them, and then sat down and did so.
As new weapons were acquired or manufactured, the Royal Nepalese Army did not throw the old ones away. They carefully stored them, and where they stored them has its own story.
The old palace had belonged to the Winston Churchill of Nepal, a man called Bimsen Thapa. Bimsen Thapa became Prime Minister in 1806. It is the most, or was, the most powerful position in Nepal. There is and was a king that was really a spiritual head of the country. Bimsen Thapa, as Prime Minister, literally ran everything. He retired as an old man in 1837 to his country and estates. In 1839, he was recalled to see the king, and when he arrived in Kathmandu, he was arrested by his enemies and charged with high treason and thrown into jail. He was a very proud man, and unfortunately, I think he got very shabbily treated and massively tortured. But they couldn't break him. And finally they told him that his senior wife and his daughters were going to be dragged through the streets of the city in the nude as a humiliation for him the following day. That night he hanged himself in his cell. His senior wife, when hearing the news the following day, threw herself from a high window in Lagan Salakana, which was the Thapa family palace.
And outside this window is where one of the madams of the household hung herself, and the rope is still up there apparently, according to the troops here.
The palace was forfeit. It became the Royal Armoury, and from that time on, it was a depository for anything that wasn't wanted.
For the next 150 years, as new weapons were introduced to the Army, whether through importation or local manufacture, the old ones were set aside and virtually forgotten in the large repository. When Cranmer first heard the story from Harry Flashman, he followed up on the one practical lead given to him.
He gave me the name of a gentleman who ran a hotel called the Royal Hotel. He was a Russian supposed count called Boris Lazanovich. Lazanovich was a ballet dancer, a hotelier, and a big game hunter. A strange mix, but nevertheless, I dashed off a letter to him with my friend Harry Flashman's encouragement, to which I did get a reply saying, yes, we've got all this stuff, come out and have a look. Well, I had no money, I was 24 years old, I worked for a living, and my dreams of having cases of antique guns coming through the mail didn't materialize. Now, I realize I should have got on the first plane, but, I just didn't do it, and that was a shame.
It was not until the early 90s that Cranmer finally made it out to Nepal. Over the years, he'd become friend and business partner with members of the Windlass family, Sudhir and Pradeep Windlass.
I personally have known Christian since 1981.
Windlass Steelcraft is a large supplier of edge weapons in India, with substantial holdings in pharmaceuticals and real estate as well. Atlanta Cutlery in the United States represents their investment in the Nepalese venture.
My brother Sudhir, met him for the first time in 1979. Since then we've been in business together, and since 1985 I think we've been partners.
I actually got into the old palace in the early 1990s with Surya Windlass, with whom I had a long-time friendship and a business relationship.
My brother went with him, inspected the goods. Sometimes they would let them see only a part of it. For us, getting involved into Nepal was because Christian had always spoken about it. Initially, it was just a business venture for us, a business opportunity, and that's how we got involved.
Through his influence, we were able to get access to Layan Selahana, this old palace in the middle of the old city in Kathmandu.
I found cookery. Look at that nice mark there. I don't know
And
what
it was
but
an
it's a nice
absolute
mark.
Aladdin's cave. I just couldn't believe it. It was 5 stories of a compounded old palace with a quadrangle in the middle, surrounded by a wall, outside of which daily life had continued on into the 20th century. But this was still 200 years in the past. There was no running water, virtually no glass in any windows. It was all louvers. No toilet facilities, no electric. I mean, it was really primitive. However, it was stuffed full of things from the past that had been put away in the middle of the 19th century and never touched.
Nepal was undergoing more change. An absolute monarchy changed into a constitutional one.
Being a totally now democratic country, they insisted on publishing what's known as a world tender, where different people from different countries could come and offer for this material.
Once the bidding was done, we ended up doing very well. We ended up winning the bid.
Our bid was $2,175,000. The commanding general at the time called us in, congratulated us, and said, of course, we can't possibly sell it to you because there's not enough money.
Through negotiations that followed, we realized they really want more money out of this than the top bidder, meaning us, IMA, and Atlantic Cutlery were able to put on the table.
We naturally explained that with this menu of about 200 tons, 30,000 guns, we just couldn't manage it. We'd given them our best shot. Then General Fedon said to me something I'd always wanted a general to say. He said, well, then go and find some smaller material. As a result, they gave us 2 colonels and a helicopter, for which we paid $600 a day, and flew us around to various other installations throughout the country to see what other material might be found. In short order, the menu increased from 200 tons, 30,000 guns, to 55,000 guns, and other material totaling 430 tons. A new tender was called for the 20th of September, just 30 days after the last one, and we in fact offered the required $3.5 million. The deal was then agreed, but it took 2 years for the Nepalese to get the various permits required and get everything ready for us to go and move the material, which started in January of 2003.
This is a particularly difficult deal in that you bid on the material. You have 50,000 muskets, associated hardware, you've got cannons, iron cannons, bronze cannons, etc. And you say it's worth X amount of money. That's the easy part. The other part is to say, logistically, what are my expenses?
By the time we had it all packed and all shipped and all delivered, we found we'd invested somewhat over $5 million.
IMA and Atlanta Cutlery used the time to plan and to prepare. In 2003, Cranmer and his colleague Mark Doughton went out to Kathmandu, an unusual mix of the modern and the medieval.
You see, like at least now.
Workers had already started packing. Total access to the palace for the first time stirred their excitement.
Brown Bess muskets, 1796. Here's a good example of the condition we found these in, with eons of dust and grease.
Doughton shot all the video on location in Kathmandu to document their discoveries and their reactions. The low light levels compelled him to shoot in this grainy style.
What is the name for this?
The first day at Login Silicana was actually a very interesting day because we were being exposed to probably 40,000 muskets that we looked at that day.
1841 pounds.
They were stacked up in basically 4x4 squares. I gotta say that it was just an amazing thing to go through.
Oh gosh, science.
Mother load of dust. Number one, we needed dust masks because the dust was as thick as snow coming down. What are we, 5 floors up?
Something like that.
We would walk from floor to floor. I think it was 4 or 5 floors high.
Hindu god. This is where they used to worship.
The building inside was adorned with murals of Hindu gods like Shiva, Ganesh. Beautiful murals, and you could tell they were hundreds and hundreds of years old. Kukris, 15,000.
Something like that.
Yes.
These are early bayonets. Yeah. These are early Brown Bess and East India Company catches. See, there's an 1853. Now these are mostly rifles. 1837. This particular one is the 1841, which was made experimentally smoothbore. It wasn't adopted in great numbers, and now we know what the British did with them.
Lawn lever?
Yes, this is 1885. Just look at the condition of that, under the dirt. Complete with its original sling. Oh, the springs are still good. Classic shape. Yep, 1842 muskets. And more Brown Besses. These actually look tolerably decent. The size of that.
What caliber? 60?
It's huge. I can almost put 2 fingers down the barrel. Back action knob. Made in percussion. Long range sights. This has to be a heavy gauge sporting gun and it's heavily rifled.
And the hallways of the building really stand out in my mind because there's something very mysterious and haunting about it. There was a huge white owl that sat on the very precipice of the roof, would look at us day after day, and it was very methodical in the way it would turn its head and watch. And no matter where you were when you looked up, that thing was looking at you. And I couldn't help but feel that it's like the spirit of Bimson Tapa or his wife.
I booked tickets to go to Kathmandu for 6 weeks. There isn't anything you can't do in 6 weeks. Boy, was I wrong. We had ordered 3,000 wood cases, each to take 25 muskets. When we got there, we had 1,500 cases, each to take 50 muskets. There was no lifting equipment. We were in a palace in which there was a courtyard and no way access, no vehicular access of any type. We had to breach the wall and have a proper gateway put in for a truck. We had to lay a road in. There was nowhere for a forklift truck.
Every day we would come home just covered with grease and soot. And we'd be crawling all over the place. But one day, Christian did find in the floor a trapdoor, and he pulled it up, and it was pitch black. And this is really interesting. We've just found a new secret passage for 2 doors into a room.
Yeah.
Which...
Look at those car wheels.
Oh, wow.
Cannon wheels. And
Look at the giant spiders. We were thrilled to find something that looked unusual, and with our flashlight, beamed downstairs into the blackness.
Look at the oil bottles. Look at that.
Another load of Martini oil bottles.
Yep.
And we thought, wow, we've hit gold this time. And all around it were rat carcasses and enormous spiders and spider webs.
It is. Look at that. Talk about primitive. That's a really old cannon. Really, really old with a spike on the back like that. Touch hole on the side. It's a matchlock cannon.
Which was a real prize. Still, that's the kind of thing that really made it interesting. We didn't find gold, we didn't find silver or gems, but we did find the secret room, and the matchlock cannon made up for it.
The palace wasn't only full of weapons.
With its lining.
Wow.
Under a staircase, we found a Shako helmet, a leather helmet, probably from the 1830s or 1840s.
It has a thing on the back, a little brass identity thing on the back, and you can see where a helmet plate was.
Right.
And then a cockade on the top.
Wow. That's a find.
In a deplorable state, but it absolutely 100% original with its lining and so on, which some soldier had just tossed in there, and there it had sat for probably the best part of 150 years.
And we've got a boneyard here. This big skull came from a rhinoceros.
In one of the rooms, which we called the boneyard, were a plethora of ivory elephant tusks, tiger's heads, and rhinoceros heads, which had been taken from the poachers in the last 100 years and stored. And our contract actually was for everything in the palace, listed or unlisted. And they were pressing us to take these things with us.
I love the way they've used old suitcases of Victorian officers.
They had suitcases with leopard skin panels in the outsides, which of course we couldn't take either, which was really a great shame, and so we left it all behind. Rifles were stored on all floors, right up to the attics in the old palace. The infrastructure of the palace did not allow us to carry these things down the existing staircases that could barely bear now, after 400 years, the weight of a man, let alone a man with an armful of hardware. So we passed the rifles and muskets out of the windows from level to level down into the courtyard for packing.
Windows make them. Then they would have to be fitted. It's just a pain in the ass.
Once in the courtyard, they were counted and packed, 50 to a case.
Basically, when you ship a container, you want to get in as many boxes and use up every square inch of room you can. And when it came down to packing and the cost associated with it, we had to take a lot of time because it was like a big game. It was like Jenga. You have to fit block in by block, and some were obtuse to the other. It took a lot of time to pack those boxes.
Because the sheer logistics of the thing was mind-boggling, really. Christian was there for 5 months, and but it was a very, very big job.
The cases each weighed in terms of 500 pounds. We had no lifting equipment other than the personnel that we had brought in ourselves. We had been given 80 troops, in theory, to help, but they were a security detail. And although they were wonderful guys, they weren't about to put themselves out. We in fact imported from Dehradun in India, where the Windlers have massive holdings, a workforce to do all the packing. And these guys, there were a dozen of them under a manager called Satish Pansri, did a fabulous job for the 5 months we were there. Once these cases had been filled, nailed, banded, they were put on end, on their sides I should say, and moved with rollers, and then manhandled through doorways, down corridors and outside, and then literally manhandled one case at a time onto a small truck which we had to buy. And then all 2,500 cases, as they were filled, were transported to the outskirts of the city to another government installation called the Scout Card Depot, where they were held until the containers arrived. This operation took almost 4 months to complete. The cannons were a big surprise. We were actually looking for small arms, nothing so substantial. And we found them actually very close to the old palace, not in the old palace, but in at a place called Tumu. And they were just stacked up like cordwood. And I said, what's this? And the captain I was with, who was sort of giving me the 10-cent tour, he said, oh, we're just smelting these for the brass. And of course it's bronze, but nevertheless. And he said, do you like tubes? I said, I love tubes. He said, well, I'm sure the general says you can have anything you want. And I said, well, I'd like to have these. He said, I can show you where we have some others. And he took me not far to some old sheds. The material had not been touched in decades and decades and decades. And it looked just like the day after, or as if they'd been put away the day after the Battle of Gettysburg. And they were covered in debris and what have you. It was just wonderful. All this material was then assessed and added to the mix and saved. Although the main content of this purchase were the antique rifles and muskets, which numbered over 50,000, and the most notable items were the cannons, we also got a great quantity of bayonets that fitted most of these muskets, something over 30,000.
Oh boy, look at this. Osborne.
But in addition, we got sabres, not huge quantities, thousands or two, mostly of British descent and local Nepali manufacture, good quality. But the most interesting thing on the edge weapon line is we got a real inside look and quantity of the legendary kukri, the Nepali weapon line.
More kukris. These are substantially heavy. Definitely takes up its head off. I've always seen them, but I can't appreciate them until you actually pick these up. You move your hands with them. There's a lot of weight in these thrust.
This is the most amazing tool and weapon imaginable. It has a big leaf forward-leaning blade, which is honed to a sharpness that is capable of taking a man's head off his body with one blow. And in fact, on 2 occasions while we were there, in order to give the troops a bit of a lift, we gave them parties and would buy goats, which they would then behead, which we got on film, and quite terrifying, with a single blow, which they would then process, cook, skin, cook, gut, whatever it is, and within 2 hours we would all be eating goat, and it was absolutely disgusting. There were 21 bearer guns. A bearer gun is a quick-fire rifle, double-barreled, developed in 1885 by a gentleman called Gahendra. Gahendra, in fact, was the son of a high-ranking politician at the time. He was like 22 years old and was given credit for this development. of this weapon. In fact, it is a virtual copy of the British Gardner gun at the time. It's in Martini-Henry caliber, .45/577. It is crank handled on the same relationship as a Gatling gun and fires each barrel alternately. Has a 120 round Pan magazine and was probably pretty effective in its day in the 1880s. We got 21 of these, and each one is, about half a ton. A very scarce and interesting development in farms history. Interestingly enough, we're all in one complex of rooms, on the ground floor at least, on their carriages, by and large all complete. They'd all had one internal cog removed as a security measure, which in fact we never found and had to replicate. But we did find additional magazines, magazine loaders, and other accessories in other locations.
A tremendous amount of equipment found in the former royal palace in Kathmandu, Lagan Sudakana. It ranges from edge weapons. There were large numbers of kukris. There were tremendous numbers of small arms, flintlock muskets, caplock muskets, comparatively modern rifles, British-type Snyders, Martini-Henrys, Lee Enfield rifles, Vickers guns, Lewis guns, swords, bayonets. A tremendous amount of equipment was found there. Statistically, I think most of it is actually British pattern, British made, supplied to the Nepalese generally from the 1880s onwards. There's a substantial number of British East India Company weapons. Most of those were acquired, they were actually taken from deserters who had fled the Indian Mutiny, gone over into the border in Nepal in 1858 and 1859 and were disarmed. The Nepalese were allowed to keep the weapons that they confiscated, perhaps to prevent the British having to pay the Nepalese for their assistance during the mutiny. And there are, of course, large numbers of Nepalese-made guns, very skillfully made, ranging from Enfield-type rifle muskets, Snyder-type rifles, even, we think, to copies of the Lee Enfield rifle dating from the 20th century.
One of the most satisfying finds, but of really rather a minor nature, we found a trials rifle for Martini-Henry. There were trials in 1869 for a rifle that was adopted in 1871, and this rifle was submitted by Alexander Henry of Edinburgh, using his patent rifling and the Martini system. His rifle, this one, was not accepted. His rifling was accepted, and another rifle actually done by the Swiss Martini was accepted, and they used the two together.
The Nepalese were somewhat devious and used a few ruses to import not just weapons but actually manufacturing equipment as well. We think this actually went back to the early days with the flintlocks, where they imported quite large numbers of English-made locks with no markings, and it's still yet to explain how that actually took place. But its typical example is the acquisition of the first Martini-Henry rifle. This was actually purchased in the summer of 1870 by an English schoolmaster. He was the head of the school in Kathmandu and personal tutor to the Prime Minister, Jang Bahadur. Now James Kenyon, the man's name, bought this Martini-Henry rifle from a well-known London gunmaker, Charles Lancaster, along with a double-barreled sporting rifle and a handful of revolvers. We know this because the invoices for this particular transaction survive in the India Office records in the British Library. These show that the rifle was bought by the schoolmaster, and he had to testify that it was for his own personal use. The British authorities actually had severe doubts that this was so, and the probability is it was acquired so that the Nepalese authorities could look at the gun and see whether it could be copied.
And it's ended up in the Royal Arsenal, and we now have it. A gun that was long since lost. And Alexander Henry, probably one of the most famous, he was a Scotsman, of Scottish gunsmiths. This was the gun, or this was the rifling, that make him, in collecting circles, a household name.
What would you say the dimensions of this room are?
8, maybe 9 feet by 6, 15.
It's a giant mound of flints from England.
We had found a large pile of stones, which in the dark sounded like we were walking on coins in one of these basements. It turned out these stones were British musket flints, delivered as a result of the Treaty of 1816, when the British Army, or the British government, had great quantities of these things left over from the Napoleonic Wars. And these have been delivered in sacks or barrels, which had long since disintegrated. And here, this basement area, which was about the size of a single car garage, was to a depth of about 4 feet of these flints. We bagged all these. Well, we cleaned them, sieved them, weighed them, bagged them. We ended up with about 1.3 million. After we had finished, I did a cursory inspection, picking the odd flint out of the walls, in the mortar joints, and so on and so forth. And I looked on the ground, and there was a brick floor, and in one spot, a brick or half a brick was missing, and there was just sort of sandy soil, and I saw a flint sticking up. So I bent down and I picked it up by candlelight. And right next to this flint was a musket ball, Brown Betts musket ball, 3/4 of an inch. And I thought, God, isn't that neat? So that found its way into my pocket. I noticed there was a second one. So I put that in my pocket. Then there was a third one. Well, after a couple of moments, I went back upstairs, got at one of the big kukris, the Gurkha knives, and I started taking up the floor.
This is truly like finding treasure.
Christian, having pulled up the floor bricks, has now found what looks like a tremendous supply of mini balls.
Now, Brown Betts musket balls.
Okay, I'm corrected.
0.75.
Look at that.
There's got to be thousands. You can't see how far down it gets, because it just doesn't stop. There's very little earth on top.
It was just like opening an egg casket. And it was all musket balls. So then I went up to get Mark, and the two of us started taking up the floor. And more musket balls yielded more musket balls and more musket balls.
These are.
And in our excitement, I mean, they might just as well have been gold coins. In our excitement, we were scooping these things out by hand, and it was filthy hot, 100 degrees. We were in candlelight. We were laughing and what have you. We'd been at it about 30 minutes. And Mark said, "Are you aware of anything?" My excitement had, obliterated any other senses that I had. And he said, there's a slight something in the air. And I noticed then that my eyes had been watering for a little while. And it was at that moment that we realized, and later confirmed, that we were digging into an old latrine.
More and more turning it. Digging continues, but the musket balls have been found basically in an L pattern on the floor in this trench that's about getting close to 10 inches deep, down and across. And this area still has to be sifted, and you can see the balls sticking through the dirt. This primitive sieve has actually done very well. They throw the buckets of ball against it, balls roll down, dirt goes right behind it.
We spent the last month, which effectively was the month of May 2003, packing containers that had come up from Calcutta. The drive from Calcutta is about 2.5 to 3 days by road. The first container arrived on May the 8th. It took us a full month to pack 31 containers, 20s and 40s mixed. Our transit permit through India, which was a requirement in the contract, unfortunately only allowed us one transit, meaning that the first container had to sit and wait until the last container was finished. We made every possible mistake that we could make. As it happened, a word that will be burned into my memory for the rest of my life called demurrage. We spent $80,000 demurrage just on holding the containers in Kathmandu until June the 12th, when the convoy set out for India. On June the 12th, the convoy of 31 containers set off on the 2.5-day to 3-day journey to Calcutta. It took 3 weeks. The monsoon had just started. The roads were washed out. Like any convoy, it's only as fast as its slowest member. One truck gave a tremendous amount of difficulties. They had to build the transmission at the roadside all one night, and then it lasted for about 400 yards and then broke down again. The soldiers then told me that they decided they would pull out all the stops, and they held what they called a puja, some religious ceremony. And the truck started, and it was the best truck in the convoy after that. Can't odds it. They rolled into Calcutta soon after the 1st of July, as I say, 3 weeks after they left, without any incident, further incident. Great success. Great expense.
Finally, the weapons arrived in Cranmer's and the Windlass's warehouses. That began a process which will take years as they sort and clean tons of material, all with an unquestionable historical provenance.
Once the crates are open and we determine which of these rifles are probably in the best condition for collectors, the first step of the operation is to go to our cleaning machines over here.
Dave DiPietro gives an explanation of the cleaning process each rifle goes through.
This uses a biodegradable detergent, which goes on a 15-minute cycle and removes much of the oils, cosmoline, and 150 years of dirt that was originally found on these guns. After the guns are washed, we usually let them set for about 24 hours for a good thorough drying. They then come over to this table where any additional residue and rust are removed with a very light steel wool. We now come to the third part of the operation, which is really the most important part. This is where the rifle is brought over to our master craftsmen. They will disassemble the piece, look at each of the part individually, and make sure that everything is functioning properly. They'll replace springs, sights, and even stocks if necessary. They look over the wood, make sure each and every component is basically exactly what it should be on that particular rifle. All the replacement parts that we use on these guns have also come from Nepal, and they're every bit as authentic as the original rifles themselves. After the rifle's been reassembled, the last step is to have various oils applied to its wood grain. This not only revitalizes the wood, but gives it that luster and beauty and brings it up to a true museum quality finish.
With this extraordinary collection of military hardware, Cranmer has invited opinions from scholars. John Walter spoke with David Penn, formerly of the Imperial War Museum in London.
Are you as overwhelmed by it as I was when I saw it first?
I think it would be a damn close-run thing to know who is more overwhelmed.
Actually, I think it would be a very good Snyder.
Absolutely, it's a splendid Snyder. It's also a very late Snyder. It's the Mark III with the locking catch.
It's just simply a question of thumbing back the hammer to half cock, squeezing the release catch, the bolt, and flipping the whole thing over to the right, which gives access to the chamber and allows you to extract and reload. Very sturdy action, wasn't it? Very, very tough indeed.
Excellent action. American design.
Indeed, yes.
The Snyder had a long and very honourable service, not only in the British Army, but the Indian Army. Some Indian units still had Snyders for rear echelon use as late as the First World War. The Nepalese started to introduce the Snyder about 1868, which is very early, isn't it?
They were very quick to buy a few. I think they bought 10 from Britain. They had a habit of importing them for, quote, sporting, unquote, use. As we'll find out with one of the Martinis, which has a story attached.
Fascinating, and this one has a unit mark.
It does, yes. It's the very, very typical, the battalion name there, then character just means number, and then the actual number, which in this particular case is 4, which is a very low number. This particular gun, because we believe this to be an Arsenal mark rather than the battalion name, may well have been used as a pattern gun, but it's something that obviously we can't prove.
The story of treasure and ancient palaces, hidden rooms, and suicide now comes to a close.
We were extremely fortunate that we had a window of opportunity in 2003, during the middle of a civil war, when there was a 6 months truce, that we were able to invest 5 months of that time extracting these weapons from the old armory. Almost certainly they would have been destroyed sooner or later.
For us also, it has become kind of a passion. And the difficulty that there is that, we are falling in love with the weapons that we see. Every day we unearth we open a new crate, we find something new. So it's like history coming back to life.
It provides for the person who ends up acquiring one of these pieces of history, it provides some amazing historical background. The historical associations that these arms bring with them greatly increases their interest in anyone with any interest whatsoever in military history.
Now with them back here in the United States and in the United Kingdom, we are able to make serious studies of what we've found. Much of the material is just as we expected, but there are many good surprises and information that has now been gained which would otherwise have been lost.
John Walter, perhaps, sums it up best.
The storerooms of Lagan and Silicana, a veritable time capsule of British military history, have given us thousands of guns, ranging from flintlock muskets to the most modern magazine rifles and machine guns. They've also given us an unforgettable and probably unrepeatable opportunity for research, and to allow many thousands of individual enthusiasts to participate in the learning process. We will never get this opportunity again.